After flying to Australia for business meetings, I arrived at my hotel at 2 a.m. in a wheelchair, and the night manager Sandra pointed at my legs, saying, "Another wheelchair scammer." She sprayed me with Lysol, poked my legs with a pen, demanding I prove it, then tore up my medical documents while saying, "Your R-word mother couldn't even birth you right." When her co-worker read my name on the papers, his face went white. "Sandra, that's the CEO." After flying to Australia for a full day of business meetings in Sydney, I wheeled into the lobby of my hotel at 2 a.m. wearing a tracksuit, exhausted beyond words. The second I walked through the doors, the night managers Sandra and Terrence stared at me like I'd brought a disease into their precious marble palace. Sandra pointed at my legs and announced, "Another wheelchair scammer." Terrence actually walked behind me and started doing this cruel impression of someone in a wheelchair, making these exaggerated rolling motions with his arms. I just took a deep breath and tried to focus on checking in. Sandra walked around the desk and got right in my face. "Prove it," she said. "Prove you actually need that chair." Before I could respond, she was demanding I pull up my pant legs. I lifted them to show my atrophied muscles, and she actually pulled out a pen from her pocket and started poking at my calves. "Can you feel this? What about this?" My face burned with humiliation as she probed my legs like I was some kind of fraud who needed to be exposed. Terrence put his hand on Sandra's shoulder. "Hey, maybe we should slow down. He might not, you know." He tapped his temple and then started speaking to me in this exaggerated, slow voice like I was a toddler. "Hello there. Do you understand what's happening? This is a hotel, a nice place where people sleep." Sandra caught on immediately. "Oh gosh, you're right. That explains everything." She leaned down close to my face and started talking super loud and slow. "Should we call someone who takes care of you?" Terrence actually started miming sleeping and pointing at the hotel like he was playing charades. I was so tired, and now I had to sit through being treated like a child who couldn't understand words. "If he can't even understand basic English," Sandra said, backing away from me, "who knows what else is wrong with him, or what he's carrying?" Terrence nodded and wiped his hands on his pants where he'd touched my wheelchair. That's when Sandra disappeared behind the desk and came back with a can of Lysol. She started spraying it all over my wheelchair and body. It stung my nostrils and made my eyes water like I was cutting onions. "Goodness knows what diseases you're carrying," she said, while half the can dripped down my wheels. I sat there soaking in Lysol, trying to breathe through my mouth, when Sandra noticed this woman checking in at the other end of the lobby. She grabbed Terrence and they started whispering and pointing at me. Sandra took out her phone and snapped my picture. "He's probably here to follow women like you into the accessible bathrooms," she said loud enough for me to hear. "It's always the ones in wheelchairs who are the pedos." I wondered which was worse, that they thought this about disabled guests, or that they felt comfortable saying it out loud. Terrence immediately ran to block the accessible bathroom door with his body, while Sandra showed my photo to the woman checking in. She started warning her about me like I was on some registry. I wanted to wheel myself out, but that would look like guilt, and I was trapped in this nightmare they'd created. 2 female employees came out of the back office, and Sandra showed them my picture too. They practically ran back to the office and locked the door. Every insult was another line in their termination letters, but they were too busy enjoying themselves to notice, especially Sandra, who was now moving toward me with purpose. She grabbed the bag off my lap. "Security check," she announced before dumping everything onto the floor. My medications scattered and rolled away. My folder of acquisition paperwork from the Australia deal spilled open, but what caught her attention were my medical documents. She snatched them up, and her face twisted into something genuinely cruel. "Your R-worded mother couldn't even birth you right," she said, holding my diagnosis paperwork. "She probably knew you'd be broken and tried to flush you out." I'd heard cruel things before, but having someone insult my mother while holding my medical papers felt different. Suddenly, she started ripping them up, throwing the pieces at my face. They fluttered down like confetti while she laughed. Terrence was taking photos of the scattered papers, saying something about showing what happens to cripples who don't belong in 5-star establishments. That's when Terrence picked up one of my medical cards from the floor. He read the name and froze completely. "James Litt," he said out loud, his voice strangled. "Sandra, that's the CEO's name." Sandra was still holding torn papers. "What?" Sandra looked from the phone to me. Same face, same name, just covered in Lysol instead of wearing a suit. "We just called the owner a child lover," Terrence whispered. "Mr. Litt, please, we didn't know," Sandra stammered, her hands shaking. Terrence was backing away, mumbling apologies, his face completely white. She instantly handed me a key card for the hotel room, and I wheeled myself into the elevator without saying a word. And once everything was said and done, I planned on making them pay, because insulting me is one thing, but insulting my mom is another. The elevator ride up felt endless. My hands gripped the wheels of my chair so tight my knuckles went white. The Lysol smell clung to everything, making my stomach turn with each breath. When the doors finally opened on the executive floor, I wheeled myself down the hallway to my suite, the key card shaking in my hand. Inside, I locked the door and just sat there in the darkness for a moment. My clothes were damp with disinfectant. My medical papers were gone, torn to pieces by someone who thought my disability made me less than human. But worse than all of that was hearing someone speak about my mother that way. She'd been gone for 5 years, and hearing Sandra use her memory as a weapon felt like a physical physical blow. I wheeled over to the desk and opened my laptop. My hands moved on autopilot as I logged into the hotel's corporate system. As CEO, I had access to everything, including the employee database. Sandra Fulton and Terrence Williams. Both had been with the company for 3 years. Sandra had 2 previous complaints for customer service issues that HR had somehow let slide. Terrence had a clean record, which made his behavior tonight even more disappointing. I started typing an email to our head of human resources, Margaret Foster. Then I stopped. An email wouldn't capture what had happened. This needed to be handled properly, with full documentation. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the security office number. Even at 3 a.m., someone would be monitoring the cameras. The security guard who answered sounded half asleep until I identified myself. Then his voice snapped to attention. I asked him to preserve all lobby footage from the past hour and make backup copies immediately. He confirmed the cameras had captured everything, including audio from the main desk area. Good. Evidence would be crucial. Next, I called Margaret directly. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice groggy but professional. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, though my voice cracked when I mentioned what Sandra had said about my mother. Margaret's sharp intake of breath told me she understood the severity. She said she'd be at the hotel within an hour to begin the investigation. I spent the next 30 minutes documenting everything while it was fresh. Every word, every action, every detail. My business training kicked in as I created a timeline of events. The acquisition paperwork from the Australia deal was scattered on the lobby floor, probably being stepped on by whoever was working the morning shift. Those documents alone were worth millions, and Sandra had thrown them around like trash. My phone buzzed. A text from Margaret saying she was in the lobby reviewing footage. Another buzz, this time from David Park, our chief operating officer. Margaret must have called him. His message was short. James, I'm horrified. Full investigation starting now. Whatever you need. I wheeled myself to the bathroom and finally got out of my Lysol-soaked clothes. The shower helped wash away the chemical smell, but not the humiliation. As I dried off, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. Same face that was on the company website, in the annual reports, in the press releases about the Australia acquisition. But tonight, that face hadn't mattered. All Sandra and Terrence had seen was the wheelchair. By the time I was dressed in fresh clothes, my phone was lighting up with messages. The head of security confirming he'd made multiple backup copies of the footage. Our legal counsel asking if I wanted to pursue criminal charges for assault and destruction of property. The general manager of the hotel apologizing profusely and asking how to proceed. I responded to each one professionally, making it clear this would be handled through proper corporate channels. No shortcuts, no special treatment, because I was the CEO. If our HR processes meant anything, they had to work for everyone, including me. A knock at my door interrupted my typing. Through the peephole, I saw Margaret standing there with her briefcase and tablet. I let her in, and she immediately apologized for what I'd experienced, but I could see the HR professional in her taking over as she set up her tablet to record my statement. For the next hour, I walked her through every detail. She asked careful questions, making sure she understood the sequence of events. When I got to the part about my mother, she paused the recording to compose herself. Margaret had been with the company for 15 years. She knew my history, knew how my mother had fought for me to have every opportunity, despite my disability. After we finished, Margaret showed me screenshots from the security footage on her tablet. There was Sandra, poking my legs with her pen. There was Terrence, miming and talking to me like I was mentally impaired. The Lysol assault was captured in clear detail. What makes someone think they can grab a stranger's medical papers and tear them up? Sandra went from poking his legs with a pen to destroying personal documents. That's such a strange jump in behavior. And there, at the end, was Sandra tearing up my medical documents while Terrence photographed the scene. Margaret's expression was grim as she closed the tablet. She informed me that both employees would be suspended immediately pending the investigation. She'd already called in the morning shift managers to ensure Sandra and Terrence wouldn't be allowed back in the building when their shift ended at 7 a.m. Security would escort them out and collect their employee badges. But as she was leaving, Margaret mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Sandra had apparently sent messages to several other night shift employees about the incident with a fake disabled guest who was probably a predator. She'd shared my photo in their group chat. The damage was already spreading. I spent the rest of the early morning hours dealing with the fallout. The general manager arrived at 5 a.m., mortified and eager to contain the situation. He'd already seen the footage and couldn't stop apologizing. I made it clear that apologies weren't enough. This was a systemic failure. How had employees felt comfortable enough to act this way? What kind of culture had we allowed to develop? By 6 a.m., the hotel's senior management team had assembled in the conference room. I wheeled myself in, still exhausted but determined. The head of security had prepared a presentation of the footage. As we watched it together, I saw several managers flinch. The head of housekeeping actually gasped when Sandra sprayed me with Lysol. The discussion that followed was intense. How had Sandra's previous complaints been brushed aside? Why hadn't Terrence's training included disability sensitivity? What message were we sending to our employees if this behavior was even possible? I made it clear that this wasn't just about two night managers. This was about our values as a company. As the meeting wrapped up, I noticed movement in the lobby through the conference room windows. Sandra and Terrence had arrived for the end of their shift. They were laughing about something, completely unaware of what was waiting for them. Margaret and the security team were already positioned by the employee entrance. I watched from the conference room as Margaret approached them. The change in their body language was immediate. Sandra's smile vanished. Terrence took a step back. Margaret handed them their suspension letters, while security officers stood nearby. Sandra started gesturing wildly, apparently arguing. Terrence just stood there, his face pale. Then Sandra spotted me through the conference room window. Our eyes met across the lobby. For a second, I saw panic flash across her face. Then something else, defiance. She said something to Margaret while pointing at me. Even from this distance, I could see Margaret's professional composure crack slightly at whatever Sandra had said. Security escorted them to collect their belongings. As they were let out, Sandra kept turning back to look at the conference room, at me. Her expression wasn't apologetic. It was calculating, like she was already planning her next move. The general manager closed the blinds, cutting off the view, but I knew this was far from over. Sandra's defiance, the group chat messages, the way she'd looked at me, it all pointed to someone who wouldn't go quietly. The investigation was just beginning, and something told me Sandra and Terrence weren't going to make it easy. I thought about my mother again, about how she'd fought for me my entire life. She'd faced down doctors who said I'd never amount to anything, teachers who wanted to put me in special programs I didn't need, employers who saw the wheelchair before they saw my capabilities. She'd taught me that dignity wasn't something others could take away. It was something you carried inside yourself. But she'd also taught me to stand up to bullies, and that's exactly what I planned to do. The morning sun streamed through my suite windows as I finished my third cup of coffee. My phone vibrated with an incoming call from Margaret. She informed me that Sandra had just filed a formal complaint with corporate HR, claiming disability discrimination and wrongful suspension. The irony wasn't lost on me. I wheeled myself down to the HR office on the second floor, where Margaret had set up a temporary investigation headquarters. She showed me Sandra's complaint on her tablet. Sandra claimed I had orchestrated the entire incident to frame her, that I had pretended to be disabled to test employee responses, and that my suspension of her was retaliation for following proper security protocols. Margaret's assistant knocked and entered, carrying a stack of printed emails. Sandra had been busy overnight, sending messages to every hotel employee she could reach. The emails painted me as an unstable CEO who enjoyed entrapping hardworking staff members. She'd even created a timeline suggesting I had planned this sting operation for months. The head of security arrived with troubling news. The backup footage from the lobby cameras had somehow become corrupted. The primary files were intact, but the redundant copies he'd made at my request showed nothing but static. He couldn't explain the technical failure, but I noticed he avoided making eye contact when delivering this information. I returned to my suite to find maintenance workers replacing the lock on my door. The hotel engineer explained that someone had attempted to access my room using an override code during the night. Security footage from the hallway showed a figure in a maintenance uniform, face obscured by a cap, trying different codes on my door panel around 4 a.m. Margaret called an emergency meeting with the senior management team. As I wheeled into the conference room, I noticed several managers exchanging glances. The atmosphere had shifted since our morning meeting. Sandra's email campaign was working. During the meeting, the head of housekeeping mentioned that 3 night shift employees had come forward to support Sandra's version of events. They claimed to have witnessed me acting aggressively in the lobby, though none of them could explain why they hadn't appeared in any of the security footage. Their stories were remarkably similar, almost rehearsed. After the meeting, I encountered Terrence in the hallway outside the business center. He looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes. He glanced around nervously before approaching my wheelchair. He started to speak, then noticed a security camera and quickly walked away, but not before I saw him slip a folded paper under a potted plant near the elevator. I retrieved the note after he left. His handwriting was shaky. "She made me do it. She has things on me. Meet me in the loading dock at 2 p.m., please." I photographed the note and forwarded it to Margaret immediately. The hotel's head of IT knocked on my suite door an hour later. He discovered something disturbing while investigating the corrupted backup files. Someone with administrative access had logged into the security system at 3:47 a.m. and run a targeted corruption script on specific file segments. The login credentials belonged to a night manager account, but the actual access had come from an IP address registered to an internet cafe 6 blocks away. I decided to take a wheelchair-accessible taxi to visit our corporate offices across town. As the driver helped me into the vehicle, I noticed a familiar figure watching from a coffee shop across the street. Sandra, despite being suspended, was photographing my every move. The taxi driver mentioned that someone had called his company asking about my destination before I'd even booked the ride. At corporate headquarters, I found David Park in his office looking concerned. He showed me his inbox, filled with anonymous emails detailing my history of erratic behavior and vendetta against hardworking employees. The emails included doctored screenshots of supposed previous complaints against me, complete with fake case numbers and dates. Our IT security team traced the anonymous emails to the same internet cafe where the security system had been accessed. Surveillance footage from the cafe was conveniently unavailable due to a system maintenance performed that morning. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Back at the hotel, I arrived at the loading dock at 2 p.m. as Terrence had requested. He was pacing nervously between delivery trucks, constantly checking his phone. When he saw me approaching, he looked ready to run. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages from Sandra. The messages revealed Sandra's web of manipulation. She had photos of Terrence from a night 2 years ago when he'd let a friend stay in an empty room without charging them. A minor infraction, but Sandra had built it up as grand theft, threatening to report him for embezzlement. She'd been holding this over him, using it to ensure his cooperation in various schemes. Terrence's hands shook as he scrolled through more messages. Sandra had been systematically gathering dirt on night shift employees for years. She had files on everyone, photos of employees taking extended breaks, records of minor policy violations, even personal information about family troubles and financial problems. She used this information to build a network of people too scared to oppose her. He showed me a group chat where Sandra was currently coordinating her defense. She had assigned roles to different employees who would corroborate her story, who would claim to have witnessed my aggressive behavior, who would spread rumors among the day shift staff. The level of organization was impressive and disturbing. Suddenly, Terrence's phone rang. Sandra's name appeared on the screen. He answered on speaker at my gesture. Sandra's voice was calm but menacing as she reminded him about their agreement and warned him against making mistakes that could affect his family. Sandra's playing chess while everyone else thought they were having a normal Tuesday, building a blackmail empire one night shift at a time, complete with corrupted files and coffee shop surveillance missions that would make spy movies jealous. She mentioned his daughter's school by name, a clear threat wrapped in casual conversation. After Sandra hung up, Terrence broke down. He admitted to helping her access the security system using his override codes. She had made him create the maintenance uniform disguise and attempt to enter my room, though he swore he was only supposed to look for evidence of my fake disability. He hadn't known about the corruption script until after it was done. I convinced Terrence to document everything in a written statement. We went to Margaret's temporary office where he spent 2 hours detailing Sandra's schemes. He revealed that Sandra had been running similar operations for years, targeting guests she deemed unworthy of the hotel, especially those with disabilities or from certain ethnic backgrounds. She kept detailed records of her activities in a hidden file on the hotel's shared drive. Margaret immediately launched a search for Sandra's hidden files while I returned to my suite. My phone rang with a call from our corporate communications director. Someone had leaked a story to a hospitality industry blog about a CEO gone rogue who was purging innocent employees. The post included my photo and enough accurate details to be damaging, mixed with enough lies to be legally problematic. The hotel's reputation management team worked to contain the story, but damage was spreading through industry forums and social media groups. Former employees who had left under suspicious circumstances began reaching out, sharing their own stories about Sandra's behavior and the toxic culture she had created on the night shift. I received a text from an unknown number: "Drop the investigation, or the corruption goes deeper than backup files." Attached was a photo of my medical records, the ones Sandra had torn up, somehow pieced back together and photographed. The message implied she had copies of my private medical information and was prepared to use it. The next morning, Margaret called with urgent news. 3 members of the investigation committee had received anonymous packages at their homes containing USB drives. The drives held what appeared to be security footage of me from various angles, edited to remove context and make innocent actions appear suspicious. One clip showed me reaching for something near a female employee, cropped to exclude that I was simply retrieving dropped papers. Our head of security discovered that Sandra had been accessing the hotel's security system for months using borrowed credentials. She had been building a library of footage she could manipulate for blackmail purposes. The extent of her surveillance network was staggering, covering not just employee areas but guest spaces as well. David Park called to inform me that 2 corporate board members had contacted him with concerns about my leadership. They had received packages similar to the investigation committee, along with a carefully crafted narrative about my deteriorating mental state since becoming disabled. Sandra was attempting to turn my own board against me. I met with our legal team to discuss options. They advised that while we had strong evidence against Sandra, her counteroffensive was muddying the waters. She had created enough doubt and confusion that a clean resolution would be difficult. They recommended focusing on protecting the company's reputation while continuing the internal investigation. That afternoon, I discovered that Sandra had accessed my personal employee file using a manager's password she had somehow obtained. She had downloaded my emergency contact information, medical accommodation records, and even my direct deposit details. The violation of privacy was complete, and I had no idea how she planned to use this information. Terrence contacted me again, this time through Margaret. He had remembered something important. Sandra kept physical backups of her blackmail materials in a safety deposit box. She had mentioned it once when hammered at a company party, bragging about her insurance policy. He didn't know which bank, but he remembered her saying it was within walking distance existence of the hotel. The investigation team began checking with nearby banks, but privacy laws made it impossible to confirm the existence of a safety deposit box without proper legal authority. We were stuck knowing crucial evidence existed, but unable to access it through proper channels. Meanwhile, Sandra's support network among the night shift was beginning to crack. 2 employees came forward independently, tired of living in fear. They corroborated Terrence's story about Sandra's blackmail tactics and provided their own examples of manipulation and coercion. One revealed that Sandra had forced her to spy on day shift managers and report any perceived weaknesses. I received another anonymous message, this time containing a video file. It showed me in my wheelchair from multiple angles, overlaid with degrading commentary about disabled people. The production quality suggested Sandra had spent considerable time creating this harassment material. The message warned that this video would be sent to every major hotel chain's HR department if I didn't drop the investigation within 24 hours. Margaret's team discovered that Sandra had been manipulating the hotel's scheduling system for years, ensuring that her allies worked together and potential whistleblowers were isolated on different shifts. She had created an echo chamber where her behavior was normalized and criticism was impossible. The stress was taking its toll on everyone involved. 2 investigation committee members requested to be removed from the case, citing mysterious personal emergencies. Margaret suspected they had been threatened but couldn't prove it. Our investigation was being systematically undermined from within. I decided to review the hotel's employee records going back 5 years. The pattern was clear: high turnover on the night shift, numerous employees leaving without giving notice, and several discrimination complaints that had been mysteriously withdrawn. Sandra's influence extended far beyond what we had initially discovered. Then came a breakthrough. One of Sandra's former allies, Bob Robbins from maintenance, approached Margaret with crucial information. He revealed that Sandra had been embezzling from the hotel for years through an elaborate scheme involving fake vendor invoices and kickbacks. She had used this money to fund her surveillance activities and maintain her network of informants. Bob provided documentation showing a clear paper trail of fraudulent transactions. He had kept copies of everything, protecting himself against Sandra's eventual betrayal. The amounts were substantial, totaling over $200,000 over 3 years. This was the evidence we needed to shift the investigation from a discrimination complaint to criminal fraud. However, Sandra must have had her own informants, because within hours of Bob's revelation, he received a package at his home. Inside were photos of his teenage son at school, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The message was clear: back off or face consequences. Bob immediately requested police protection for his family. The situation was escalating beyond workplace drama into dangerous territory. I called an emergency meeting with David Park and our legal team. We needed to act quickly before Sandra's increasingly desperate measures caused real harm to someone. Our lawyers began preparing a comprehensive case file for law enforcement, focusing on the embezzlement charges while documenting the pattern of harassment and intimidation. The disability discrimination aspect would be handled internally, but the financial crimes required external intervention. As we prepared our strategy, I received word that Sandra had been spotted at the hotel despite her suspension. Security footage showed her entering through a service entrance using an old access code that hadn't been deactivated. She spent 40 minutes in the administrative offices before leaving with a box of documents. The head of security immediately changed all access codes and passwords, but the damage was done. We had no idea what Sandra had taken or what she planned to do with it. The investigation had become a race against time to stop her before she could execute whatever plan she was developing. That evening, as I reviewed the day's developments in my suite, I reflected on how a simple business trip had turned into a battle for the integrity of my company. Sandra had revealed herself to be more than just a bigoted employee. She was a calculating predator who had been exploiting our systems for years. But her network was crumbling. More employees found the courage to come forward, sharing their stories and providing evidence. The truth was emerging despite Sandra's efforts to suppress it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but I was confident that justice would prevail. The investigation was far from over, and Sandra still had cards to play. But with each passing hour, her position weakened while ours grew stronger. The final confrontation was approaching, and I was ready for whatever she might throw at us next. The next morning brought a development I hadn't anticipated. Margaret arrived at my suite with a flash drive and a grim expression. The IT team had finally cracked Sandra's hidden files on the hotel server. What they found made my stomach turn. Sandra had documented every single incident of discrimination she'd orchestrated over 3 years. Photos of disabled guests with cruel commentary, screenshots of messages mocking elderly visitors, audio recordings of her coaching other employees on how to make certain guests uncomfortable enough to leave. She'd created a trophy collection of her cruelty, but buried in those files was something else. A folder labeled Insurance, containing forged documents implicating various managers in discrimination lawsuits. Curious how Sandra kept such detailed records of her own crimes. Makes me wonder if she never really thought she'd get caught, or if there's something else going on with this documentation obsession she clearly Clearly, she'd been preparing to frame multiple people if her position was ever threatened. My name appeared on several fabricated complaint forms, complete with fake signatures and dates. I wheeled myself to the conference room where David Park was waiting with our legal team. They'd spent the night analyzing Sandra's embezzlement scheme. The fake vendor invoices traced back to shell companies registered under aliases. She'd been careful, but not careful enough. One of the bank accounts receiving kickbacks was registered to her mother's maiden name. The head of security interrupted our meeting with urgent news. Sandra had been spotted entering the hotel through the parking garage. Security cameras showed her heading toward the IT server room with what looked like industrial magnets in her bag. She was trying to destroy the physical evidence. I followed security to the basement level, my wheelchair motor straining on the service ramp. We found Sandra in the server room, frantically waving magnets near the backup drives. The IT manager stood frozen in the doorway, clearly threatened into compliance. Sandra's face went white when she saw me. She dropped the magnets and bolted for the emergency exit. Security moved to intercept, but she'd planned her escape route. A maintenance cart blocked the main corridor, forcing them to take the long way around. By the time they reached the parking garage, she was gone. Back in Margaret's office, we discovered Sandra had sent a new wave of emails during her escape. This time, she'd included the forged documents from her insurance folder, claiming I'd covered up multiple discrimination incidents. Several board members had already received the files. Terrence appeared at Margaret's door, visibly shaking. He'd received a voicemail from Sandra threatening to expose something about his wife's immigration status unless he recanted his statement. He played the recording for us, Sandra's voice cold and calculating as she listed personal details about his family. The investigation committee reconvened that afternoon. Two members who'd previously withdrawn returned, angry about being manipulated. They'd discovered the personal emergencies that forced their withdrawal were based on false information Sandra had planted about their children's schools. Our IT security team made a crucial discovery. The corrupted backup files weren't completely destroyed. Using specialized recovery software, they'd restored fragments showing Sandra's discriminatory behavior. The audio was partially corrupted, but her voice was unmistakable as she instructed Terrence on how to humiliate disabled guests. Margaret received a call from the bank where Bob had suspected Sandra kept her safety deposit box. While they couldn't confirm its existence, they mentioned that someone matching Sandra's description had tried to access a box that morning, but fled when asked for additional identification. The hotel's night auditor, Daniel, approached me privately. He'd been keeping his own records of Sandra's behavior, documenting incidents in a personal journal. He'd been too scared to come forward before, but seeing others speak up gave him courage. His journal contained dates, times, and detailed descriptions of Sandra targeting vulnerable guests. David Park called an emergency board meeting. I presented the evidence we'd gathered, including the restored footage, embezzlement documentation, and witness statements. Several board members who'd received Sandra's forged documents admitted they'd had doubts about their authenticity. The crude forgeries didn't match our company's document standards. That evening, Sandra made her biggest mistake. She contacted a local blogger known for hospitality industry gossip, trying to sell her story about corruption at our hotel. The blogger, who'd worked with our PR team before, immediately alerted us. Sandra had offered to provide exclusive evidence in exchange for cash. We arranged for the blogger to meet Sandra while our security team waited nearby. She showed up with a box of documents and a laptop full of edited security footage. As she began her presentation, painting me as a vindictive CEO who discriminated against her for doing her job, our security team documented everything. The laptop contained more than edited footage. Sandra had accidentally included her original files showing the full context of each incident. Her attempts to doctor the evidence had preserved the source material. We now had irrefutable proof of her manipulation tactics. Margaret's team worked through the night preparing termination documentation. The embezzlement evidence was forwarded to law enforcement. By morning, we had a comprehensive case that addressed both the discrimination and financial crimes. The next day, I met with every employee who'd been affected by Sandra's schemes. Some had been blackmailed for years. Others had left the company rather than continue working under her shadow. Each story reinforced how much damage one person could do when left unchecked. Bob Robbins returned with additional evidence. He'd convinced two other maintenance workers to share their experiences. They revealed Sandra had been selling master key codes to outside parties, compromising hotel security. The money from these sales had funded her surveillance network. Our HR team discovered Sandra had been using her access to manipulate employee reviews. Anyone who challenged her received poor evaluations. Those who complied got glowing recommendations. She'd created a system where opposing her meant career sewers lied within the hotel. I received word that Sandra had been detained at the airport trying to leave the country. The embezzlement charges had triggered a travel restriction. Police found her carrying multiple fake IDs and a significant amount of cash. The safety deposit box key was in her pocket. With a warrant, authorities accessed the safety deposit box. Inside were USB drives containing blackmail material on dozens of current and former employees. There were also records of her embezzlement scheme going back 5 years, predating our initial investigation investigation timeline. The investigation committee issued their final report. It detailed systemic failures that allowed Sandra to operate unchecked. They recommended comprehensive policy changes, including regular audits of manager access privileges and mandatory reporting systems for discrimination complaints. I met with Terrence one last time. Free from Sandra's influence, he broke down completely. He admitted to participating in similar schemes at his previous job, where Sandra had also worked. She'd recruited him specifically because she knew his history made him easy to control. The full scope of Sandra's network became clear as more employees came forward. She'd built a culture of fear and compliance that extended beyond the night shift. Day managers had ignored complaints because Sandra had dirt on them. Security staff had looked the other way because she'd threatened their jobs. Our legal team prepared a comprehensive report for law enforcement. The embezzlement alone totaled over $300,000 when including the key code sales. The discrimination violations affected at least 40 documented guests, with potentially dozens more who never reported their experiences. I spent hours reviewing our hiring practices with Margaret. How had we missed the warning signs? Sandra's previous employers had given neutral references, we discovered, because she'd threatened them too. Her entire career was built on intimidation and manipulation. The hotel implemented immediate changes. All manager access codes were reset. Security protocols were overhauled. A new anonymous reporting system was established. Every employee would undergo discrimination prevention training, starting with the management team. As the investigation concluded, I thought about the guests Sandra had hurt. The elderly man who'd been mocked for using a walker. The woman with a service dog who'd been harassed. The teenager with autism who'd been humiliated in front of his family. Each incident was a failure of our company's values. Sandra's termination was processed along with 3 other employees who'd actively participated in her schemes. Terrence was terminated, but offered a chance to seek counseling. Several managers received warnings for failing to act on complaints. The police investigation continued beyond our internal process. Sandra faced multiple charges, including embezzlement, extortion, and identity theft. Her network of fake vendors and shell companies suggested this wasn't her first operation of this type. I returned to my regular CEO duties, but the experience had changed my perspective. We'd built a successful company, but failed to protect the most vulnerable guests and employees. That failure was ultimately mine to own. The hotel slowly began to heal. Employees who'd worked in fear started to relax. Guests with disabilities reported feeling welcomed. The night shift, free from Sandra's influence, transformed into one of our most customer-focused teams. 6 months later, during a routine review, Margaret showed me guest satisfaction scores. Complaints about discrimination had dropped to 0. Employee morale surveys showed dramatic improvement. The culture Sandra had poisoned was finally recovering. I kept a photo from that night on my desk, not of the humiliation, but of my mother. She'd taught me to fight for dignity and justice. Facing down Sandra's cruelty had honored those lessons. The hotel was now a place she would have been proud of. Time really does fly when you're tossing around clever observations. Appreciate you letting me share my particular brand of commentary, quirks and all. Catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.